Hi everyone, welcome to a new video. If you're new to my channel, my name is Rita and I do videos about book reviews because I love reading and I'm incredibly excited about getting everyone reading. And if this is the sort of thing you enjoy, then please consider becoming part of my Patreon group. Every month I share a book of the month that I select for you guys, and then I also do personalized book reviews where, based on your likes and dislikes, every month I pick a book for you that I think you're really going to enjoy, and I hope this way to introduce you to your absolute favorite of all time. So this week's video is going to be about Peter Pan. Now, this has been one of my favorite books in a really, really long time. I've always loved the story of Peter Pan, and I hadn't read it in a while. I guess I just spent a long time stuck in Austenland when I was doing my PhD, and everything else kind of became secondary. So for Christmas I asked for this, the annotated Peter Pan the Centennial Edition, which has about 300 pages of extra content about the book and the context in which it was written, and it's edited by Maria Tatar, who is a professor of literature in Harvard University. And I just couldn't believe the amount of detail that had gone into this book. The notes are often bigger than the text itself, and there's just so much about Peter Pan that I did not know. I thought I knew this story quite well because it was one of my favorites, but through this book I found out so much more about it, and what I'm going to do in this video is share some of my favorite facts that I've learned about Peter Pan with you. So, number one, you may know the statue of Peter Pan that is by the Serpentine in Hyde Park, and it's my absolute favourite place in all of London. But what I thought was really interesting was that when he ordered the statue, Barry wanted to create the illusion for the children that it had appeared out of magic in the park. So he put a little advertisement in the Times, basically saying that for all the children walking alongside the Serpentine the next morning, there would be a little surprise for them. And so the statue of Peter Pan was meant for the children to have appeared just out of nowhere, just magically, which I thought was really cute. And even though Barry wasn't completely happy with the statue because it was modelled after a photograph he had of Michael Davis, and he said the statue didn't quite capture the devil of Peter, as he put it, so the devilish quality of Peter Pan, it's still a wonderful statue, and it features in my favourite movie of all time, which is an adaptation of Peter Pan, Hook, and I just absolutely love that place. Number two, you may know that Barry donated the rights of Peter Pan to the Great Ormond Street Hospital, but what you may not know was that Parliament, particularly the House of Lords, actually changed the Copyright Designs and Patent Act so that the hospital could continue to benefit from the sale of the copyright of the book, which I think is just wonderful. Number three, one thing I found out about this book that I thought was really interesting was that flying children was actually something quite rare and that rarely appeared in stories, and that pretty much the only exception were the stories of Hans Christian Andersen. And then obviously afterwards this became such a central part of children's literature and of fantasy, and we see it in The Wizard of Oz with Dorothy flying in the house from Kansas, and in Harry Potter, for example. So it's really interesting to think that something that we associate so much with fantasy and with children's literature was actually a very rare thing that James Barrie popularized in Peter Pan. Number four, some people, so some critics, have suggested that the entire genre of children's literature is just basically impossible. It's contradictory in itself, because you have this world that is created by an adult for children, but the adult always comes first and the children always come second, which I think is, I had never thought about it before. And one of the original things about Barry is that he was one of the first to break the separation between adult and children. So one of the things that I'd never noticed about the narrator in Peter Pan until I've read this is that he's constantly contradicting himself. I feel like nowadays an editor would never have let these things pass. The narrator would have turned to Barry and been like, no, you absolutely have to be consistent. Is the narrator an adult or a child? Make up your mind. It's very confusing. And yet it's one of the wonderful things about Peter Pan. It's the fact that you have this narrator that in some situations really sides with Peter and the Lost Boys and the children in their childish behavior and in their possibly poorly constructed decisions and in their assumptions that are so clearly childlike. And then on the other hand, you also have the same narrator having to accept the fact that they are an adult and that they are not like these children. So there are many parts in the novel where the narrator says, oh, now we can't follow the children, or he indicates that he is barred from Neverland and that he can't get in because he's an adult and because Neverland isn't inviting him anymore. So I thought that was quite interesting how he's trying to break this separation between adult and child. And another thing I thought was quite interesting is that Barry kept denying that he wrote Peter Pan. So he would so often attribute it, for example, to the Davis Boys and saying that children wrote it. And he would even say that he didn't have a manuscript, a first manuscript of Peter Pan. Or so he would either say that the story came about, he doesn't know where from, he certainly doesn't have the manuscript, I guess the children wrote it. And he describes how when he was walking around with the Davis Boys around Kensington Gardens, how Michael invented Tinkerbell, for example. So I thought that was really interesting, how he was completely rejecting that authority, basically. He refused to put himself on kind of a pedestal looking down at the children and taking authority over his own story. He was always trying to share it with the children and to present it as a communal effort, which I thought was really, really interesting, and it's very much of a Barry thing. One thing that I had no idea before, and this is going to be number 5, is that Tinkerbell is so named because she fixes pots and pans. I had no idea, but a tinker is a name for a person who would go from town to town fixing objects made out of metal, including pans. Did you know this? I had no idea. And Victorian culture at the time had a huge fascination with fairies, so there were loads of wallpapers decorated with fairies. Plays at the time that featured fairies, like A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, were played over and over again. And another thing I learned from this book was that the cult of the fairies was something that was portrayed as a statement against the rise of industrialization, and also a kind of nostalgic way of celebrating what they saw as the enchantments of the countryside that they saw as being lost through this increasing industrialization. So I thought that was very interesting as well, that this period had such a deep fascination with fairies that Barry is very much referencing in Peter Pan. So number 6 is that the famous sentence, "second started to write," could have actually originated from a letter between James Barrie and Robert Louis Stevenson. So one thing that I found really interesting about Barrie is that he belonged to this circle of authors that all knew each other or had at least heard about each other. So he was a great admirer of Robert Louis Stevenson. he would have known Henry James and met people like Mark Twain, for example, would have also known about him. So all of pretty much every single famous author in this period that you can think of, Barrie either knew them or was corresponding with them, basically. And an interesting thing about Robert Louis Stevenson is that when he started suffering from tuberculosis, he basically went into an island by himself, as you do. And in a letter, he gives him directions as to how to get to the island, because Barrie really wanted to go and see the island, and he really wanted to go and meet him. And this journey never actually took place, but in the letter, Stevenson says, "You take the boat to San Francisco, and then my place is second to the left." And so, because these directions were given in such an interesting way, Marietta Tarr here is arguing that this would have been the inspiration to the very uncommon address, second star to the right. Number 7. So if you know Peter Pan, then you know that scene where Tink stops Peter from being poisoned by Hook by drinking his medicine. So you know that Peter is adamant that he's going to drink the medicine, even though when Tink is trying to warn him that Hook has put some poison in it. So what happens is that Tink drinks up the medicine, and then she's laying down on the verge of death, and she tells Peter that she thinks she can be saved if only children can show that they believe in fairies, and that that's the only way of saving her. And so in order to show that they do believe in fairies, children would have to clap. So they would have to clap for Tink. And in the play, Barrie was prepared for the eventuality of the audience not playing along, but he was very pleasantly surprised to realize that the audience was more than happy to play along, and that they all started clapping very excitedly. And another thing that I thought was really cute is that this was one aspect of the audience participation, but there was another one that I'd never heard of, which is, and if you know Peter Pan, you also know the famous thimble scene in which, in order to not offend him, Wendy says that she wants to give Peter a thimble because he doesn't realize what a kiss is, so Wendy instead calls it a thimble. And in this scene, the audience would start throwing thimbles at Peter, and there's a really adorable letter written by someone who went to see the play as a little girl, and she describes how she was, throwing her thimble and shouting at Peter, trying to get his attention, and she says that her voice must have gone hoarse from how much she was shouting, but that there were so many other people doing it and throwing their thimbles and shouting that she doesn't think that Peter heard her. So I just thought that was really, really adorable. Number 8 is something that I hadn't realized about Peter Pan until I reread it this time and did it alongside all the amazing footnotes in this edition, which is that it's such a story where if you blink it, you miss it. So there are so many details that Barrie just casually throws in there, and that if you're just reading it for the plot, you won't realize them. And one of them that I thought was quite interesting was that the crocodile that chases Hook around is actually gendered as female. So it says at some point, "When they have passed, comes the last figure of all, a giant crocodile. We shall see for whom she is looking presently." And obviously they mean Hook. She's, swimming around trying to find Hook and get his other hand. And it's interesting because at another point they say that the pirates describe him as a he, whereas the narrator is telling you very explicitly that it's a she. So, this is one of those things where you can decide whether you trust the narrator or not, because they have shown themselves to be quite unreliable sometimes. But my interpretation of this is that the crocodile is female, but the pirates are insisting on the fact that it has to be a male because only a male crocodile could have been strong enough to defeat Captain Hook. It has to be a male crocodile. So that kind of fragile masculinity thing going on here, and I just think it's really funny that Barrie insisted on being like, no, it's a female crocodile. Hook has been defeated by a female crocodile, and that's the way things are. So I thought that was a very interesting fact that had completely escaped me in all of the different times in which I had read Peter Pan along the years. So number 9, if you've read Peter and Wendy, that then became Peter Pan when Barrie turned it into a novel, it contains a chapter called When Wendy Grew Up. And it basically shows Peter coming over to see Wendy, but because he is really bad at telling time, he has no conception whatsoever of how much time has gone by, and actually several years have gone by, and Wendy is now a grown woman. So you have this kind of heartbreaking scene where she has to tell Peter that no, she can't go with him to Neverland because she's forgotten how to fly. And Peter takes her daughter instead because it's all the same to him. So in this scene was only played in the play once, and it was called An Afterthought. And this scene was introduced by a baby mermaid, for some reason that I'm sure made sense to Barrie, but no one else. And it was the first and only time it was ever played, and at the end of it was also the first and only time that James Barrie appeared on stage, and he received, as a result, a 15-minute ovation. So clearly the audience had a lot of love for Mr. Barrie. And finally, one of the most interesting things I found out about Peter Pan, and this is number 10, was that Barrie was actually really excited about the prospect of Peter Pan being turned into a movie. So he really wanted to see what they could do with the film format that they hadn't been able to do with the play. So he himself wrote a script for Peter Pan that is actually at the end of this edition, and it's very interesting, definitely, even though Paramount Studios, who took over the movie, basically decided not to use it, and one of the reasons might have been that Barrie was slightly too ambitious with some of the things, some of the scenes they wanted them to do. Like one of the first scenes in which Peter appeared would see him riding on a goat and then, you know, flying into a tree and then falling on the goat again, or something like that. So I think the director probably read that and was like, yeah, we can't make that work. So they decided not to use it, and instead they decided to make a movie where the Darlings were an American family. So, you know, the movie, apparently, there's only one remaining copy of the movie in the entire world, and apparently it just screams American patriotism at you at several points throughout the movie, and it changed several things. So the skull and bones in the flag in the pirate ship is replaced by the American flag, and there are several scenes where Wendy says that she hopes her brothers and the Lost Boys will act like proper English gentlemen. For example, when Captain Hook is saying that either they become pirates or he's going to kill them all, basically, Wendy says that she hopes they will behave like proper English gentlemen, except that in the movie they replace it with "will die" as American gentlemen. So, you know, kind of weird to imagine the Darling Children as an American family, but that's what they went with. But I thought it was really interesting because I'm also a very big fan of P.L. Travers, who wrote Mary Poppins, and she's the complete opposite when it comes to this. She was absolutely terrified of her book being turned into a movie. She really, really opposed it, whereas James Barrie seemed to be quite open to the idea, even if they ended up not really using his ideas that much for the movie. So yeah, I thought this was quite interesting, and he also was very interested in the idea of creating a story about what would happen to Peter Pan in the future, so a kind of what if Peter grew up kind of story, and that many, many decades after his death became Hook, my favourite movie of all time. So this is my video for this week, and I would highly, highly recommend this edition of Peter Pan. It's just absolutely beautiful and full of so many details that you will not find anywhere else, and I can highly recommend it to anyone who is a Peter Pan fan or who would just like to know more about it. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like it and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss any of my content. And do consider joining us on my Patreon community because we're a fun bunch to be around. So I will see you guys next week, and until then, stay safe and stay well.